Okay, welcome back. So one of the major sources of globalization, as we mentioned a couple times, is trade. And of course, as I mentioned also, there's a variety of reasons that trade is so important. I mean, trade is not always just an exchange of goods and services. Again, there's culture that goes with products and services. There are practices. There's all sorts of kind of implied things with every product. Again, for example, think about, again, use McDonald's as an example. In some ways, I know that like when I lived in France, McDonald's was seen as a symbol of American imperialism. It was seen as pushing out local French firms. I don't personally believe that, but that was the general perception that people held. So, again, it's not just someone buying a Big Mac. It's not just Big Macs being exported from America. It's also the implication that a hamburger is, the American way is in some way, including a hamburger, is in some way better or preferential to a local practice. Now, trade, international trade, I should say, has increased about 50-fold over the past 60 years. I mean, that's huge. And again, as I mentioned, with this trade, you have more and more globalization that comes with it. Now, you have to remember, there was always some element of international trade, at least in Western Europe. I mean, there has been since the Roman Empire, even before that, perhaps. But kind of starting towards the 1800s, globalization kind of began to speed up a little bit. And the first part was the richest European nations were using colonies to promote trade. And let's talk about why that is. They did it because of a policy of mercantilism. You guys see me okay? What's mercantilism? Well, mercantilism comes from the realist school of international relations. And what it basically says is that money is something that can be used to build a military. And the more money you have, the better military you have, and the more successful you would be in a war with your neighbors. Okay? So what does that mean? It means that your goal as a country is to hoard as much gold and money as you possibly can so that you can build that army up and then go attack your neighbors. That's mercantilism. So it's national power being increased by managing the economy to create a trade surplus. So exports to colonies in particular were promoted, but imports, in particular imports from neighboring European countries, were restricted. Okay, so it's trying to get that export surplus, more money, and then you go just take your neighbor's land. Now, following kind of the end of the mercantilist era and leading up to about World War I, there was actually quite a bit of globalization that was occurring, and there was a lot of free trade that was being encouraged. But World War I, particularly from an American perspective, kind of put a damper on free trade and globalization, particularly with European countries. That war was so horrible that people really said, we'd rather just stay out of anything European. No wars, no products, nothing. We didn't want it. And, of course, this kind of culminated with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930. What's the Smoot-Hawley Tariff? It basically restricted most imports to the United States. And the goal was, and you have to remember this is around the Great Depression era, the goal was to boost or elevate American wages and make sure that we produced everything within the U.S. And in defense of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, for the first 6 months, that was the case. There was a lot of employment created, but then what happens? It winds up becoming what we call tit for tat. So as we raise our tariffs, our friends in Canada and Mexico and Europe wound up also elevating their tariffs, and then we couldn't export anything, and it wound up actually probably worsening the Depression. And this brings us up to a good point. What's a tariff? A tariff is basically a tax or a duty charged by one government on goods that move across the border. Let me give an example. Let's say you have wine from France, okay, and you want to send it to the United States. Well, there might be an import tariff or an import duty on it of, I don't know, 15% for French wine. So when French wine comes in, you've got to pay an extra 15% tax, okay? And so that's a good example of a tariff. Now, as I mentioned, this Smoot-Hawley tariff, this idea of, it was kind of the first step in a variety of measures in the United States where we wanted to kind of isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. We want to stay out of those nasty European conflicts. And this led to a policy called autarky. And autarky is basically a policy of national self-sufficiency and isolationism and basically economic independence. So the policy is to have nothing to do with your neighbors. We do everything we produce in our own country. And that was our policy. Again, trying to stay out of Europe and all those nasty wars. There is one country, coincidentally, that still practices openly a policy of autarky, and that's North Korea. And their policy is called Juche, which is basically everything in the North Korea has to produce everything that North Korea needs. There won't be a lot of trade with the outside. Again, because globalization is not just the influx of foreign products, but it's also the influx of foreign culture that goes along with that. Now, of course, we were pulled into World War II, and that more or less ended our policy of autarky. And after the end of World War II, we actually had another wave of globalization. And this was one that was led by us here in the States. So the Allies met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and we basically came up with this agreement. And we started coming up with a variety of institutions designed to promote globalization and also to ward off communism. So these, of course, are the World Bank, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the International Trade Organization. Again, it was basically what took us out of our shell, our isolationist tendencies that had been so popular kind of towards the late 20s and then all through the 30s. So those institutions that I mentioned, again, I do want to point out it was not just about globalization, but it was also to starve off communism. So I'm looking at our time. We'll go ahead and stop here.